Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling some really specific and pretty high-stakes source material concerning cross-strait relations.
That's right, focusing on that very sensitive dynamic between mainland China and Taiwan.
Exactly. And our mission here, just to be clear, is not about taking sides.
Nope. We're really just digging into the arguments, the strategies, the facts as they're presented by analysts on the mainland.
Right, so you, our listener, can get a clear understanding of that specific perspective.
And it's a really crucial perspective to grasp, wouldn't you say? Because basically everything we'll talk about today, it all comes back to this core belief found in these sources, the idea that unification is, and they use this specific phrase, the heartfelt desire of the Chinese people, and is irreversible.
Irreversible. That's strong.
It is. And they frame the whole current situation around this contrast. They say the U.S. is, quote, creating disorder. They call it the U.S. new chaos.
Okay, the U.S. new chaos.
While China, on the other hand, is maintaining calm, or the China new certainty. And that belief, that certainty, really shapes their whole approach.
Okay, so let's unpack that geopolitical frame first. The sources are pretty adamant that the timing and the means of unification, they're not set by Washington anymore.
No, the claim is they are now controlled by us, meaning China. That's a huge shift in asserting initiative.
It really is.
Yeah.
So how do they back that up? They look at U.S. actions.
Exactly. They point to what they see as increasingly erratic U.S. behavior as proof of this U.S. new chaos.
Erratic how?
Well, look at the example they highlight. President Biden publicly hints the U.S. would defend Taiwan.
I remember that.
And then, almost immediately, the White House has to step in and clarify that, no, the official policy of strategic ambiguity hasn't changed.
Right, that kind of back and forth.
Right.
What do the sources say that signals?
They argue it shows, a lack of a unified strategy, maybe even internal conflict within the U.S. system. It feeds their narrative.
Yep.
And they also point to things like Secretary Blinken pushing for Taiwan to have meaningful participation in the UN.
And their take on that is?
They dismiss it instantly. Call it a pipe dream.
A pipe dream, why?
Simple. China holds a permanent veto on the UN Security Council. So from their perspective, any U.S. diplomatic effort on that front that ignores this reality is basically futile. Wasted effort.
Right, just running into a brick wall, constitutionally speaking, within the UN.
Pretty much.
So let's shift gears a bit. What about Taiwan's actual value to the U.S., according to this analysis? How important is it really in their view?
This is a really critical point they emphasize. The argument in these sources is that Taiwan is fundamentally not a core U.S. security interest.
Not core, despite everything we hear.
Not according to this analysis. They lean hard on geography. They say the second island chain, think Guam, the Philippines, that's far more vital for U.S. maritime routes and power projection, whereas the first island chain, where Taiwan is, well, it's just too close to the mainland to be reliably defended in a major conflict and too far from core U.S. operational hubs.
And they have that very memorable phrase for it.
Oh, yeah. It's unforgettable. Taiwan is tasteless to eat and a pity to discard.
Wow. That's blunt.
It's incredibly cynical, isn't it? It suggests the U.S. views Taiwan as this awkward problem, not worth a full-blown war, but politically difficult to just abandon.
So the analysis implies the U.S. will prioritize its own interests, its own profit maybe, over Taiwan's actual defense.
That's exactly the implication.
Yeah.
It ties back into that U.S. new chaos theme, perceived self-interest, and maybe erratic priorities over stated commitments.
Okay, so if that's the supposed U.S. view, cynical, transactional coal, how does the Chinese perspective contrast in these documents?
It's a stark contrast. For China, the sources consistently hammer home that Taiwan is a non-negotiable core interest.
That distinction is everything.
It is, because identifying it as core justifies, in their framework, the willingness to use all necessary means, potentially at any cost, to prevent independence and achieve unification.
So you have this asymmetry. One side claiming total commitment, the other portrayed as having, well, limited liability.
Precisely. That's the picture they paint.
All right, so moving on from the purely geopolitical, a key insight here seems to be a shift in language, right? From just peace towards actively emphasizing unification within the idea of peaceful unification.
Yes, exactly. It suggests an acceleration, a more proactive stance using means short of actual war.
So what does that acceleration look like? What are these non-military tools they're talking about?
We're talking about a whole toolkit. Administrative measures, legal tactics, financial levers, and of course, economic pressure.
Okay.
The idea is to shape the political environment, to apply pressure in ways that leverage China's economic weight without needing military force.
Do you give a specific example? This administrative pressure, what does that mean?
Well, a textbook case is the recent announcement of sanctions against specific individuals labeled as die-hard Taiwanese independent separatists. They name names Su Zhenchang, Yu Xikun, Wu Chaoxie.
Right, I saw that. But are those just symbolic, like travel bans?
They're more than symbolic. They explicitly prohibit these individuals and even their families from doing business or having any financial dealings with the mainland, Hong Kong, or Macau.
Okay. So it hits their personal finances, potentially. But how does that influence broader politics?
Because the real teeth, according to the sources, come from the next step. Targeting the financial backers of these figures.
Targeting the donor.
Exactly. Cut off their company's access to the mainland market, which they constantly remind everyone is the world's largest consumer and potentially largest investment market.
So if you're a major Taiwanese business person, your ability to operate in that massive market could become conditional on your political leanings, or at least on who you support.
That's the implied threat. It creates a powerful incentive structure, doesn't it? Your economic future tied to political alignment.
And the sheer scale of the economic connection makes this threat very real. There's a statistic mentioned.
A very powerful one. The sources claim that something like 80% of Taiwan's companies have business ties to the mainland. 80%.
Wow. So these aren't just pinprick sanctions. They could have a massive ripple effect through the Taiwanese economy.
That's the strategy. The analysts clearly see this economic entanglement as their strongest non-military lever. It's a form of deep economic coercion aimed at nudging, or maybe shoving, the political situation on the island in their desired direction.
Okay, let's pivot from that broad economic pressure to the real elephant in the room, semiconductors. This seems to be the one area where the sources concede Taiwan has immense strategic value, right?
Immense value, yes, but specifically for the U.S. economy, maybe even more than for defense, according to this perspective.
Interesting distinction. So it's about economic security for the U.S.
Precisely. It's framed as economic vulnerability. The sources look very closely at the U.S. move demanding commercial data from chip giants like TSMC and Samsung.
Yeah, that caused quite a stir.
And they don't interpret it as simple data gathering. They see it as a national security move by the U.S. driven by fear.
Fear of what, exactly?
Fear of losing control. The nightmare scenario they paint is straightforward. If, or as they see it when, unification happens, China would suddenly control roughly 60% of the world's advanced chip manufacturing.
That would be a massive global choke point.
Absolutely enormous.
Oh.
So the analysis argues that the U.S. demanding data, maybe encouraging some production shifts, imposing export controls, it's all part of an attempt to, quote, hollow out Taiwan's core industry.
Hollow it out. That's strong language. What do they mean by that?
They mean they believe the U.S. is trying to grab as much value, secure its own supply chains, and perhaps transfer know-how before what they see as inevitable unification occurs.
So essentially weaken Taiwan's main strategic asset for U.S. benefit before losing access.
That's the accusation. They frame it as a cold, calculated move that serves American interests but ultimately damages the Taiwanese economy and its people. It fits back into that tasteless-to-eat narrative. Use it while you can before discarding it.
It's certainly a narrative designed to sow distrust between Taiwan and the U.S.
Highly effective in that regard, potentially.
Okay, but what about the other side of the chip equation? Mainland China's own progress. Are they just waiting for TSMC?
No, they acknowledge the current gap. The analysts estimate the mainland is maybe 5 years behind TSMC's most cutting-edge chips.
5 years is significant in tech.
It is, but the tone is one of high confidence. They highlight the rapid progress they're making in slightly less advanced nodes like 14-nanometer and 8-nanometer chips.
Which are still crucial for many industries.
Absolutely. Cars, consumer electronics, tons of applications. They see this progress as proof they're quickly building self-reliance. And interestingly, they view U.S. pressure and export controls not just as a challenge, but actually as an accelerant for their own domestic R&D.
So the restrictions are backfiring, in their view, pushing them to innovate faster.
That's the argument, pushing them toward independence from foreign tech supply chains much quicker than they might have otherwise moved. Now, beyond the hard power, the economics, the tech, the sources also touch on cultural and societal angles, using soft power.
Right, trying to win hearts and minds, or at least shape perceptions.
Sort of. It's about making unification seem not just inevitable, but maybe even desirable, or at least normal.
And this is where that high-speed rail plan comes in.
Yeah.
That seemed like a very specific piece of messaging.
It really was, including that Fuzhou to Taipei high-speed rail line in the official 2035 National Transportation Outline. It's not just infrastructure planning.
No, it felt symbolic.
Deeply symbolic. And it wasn't just a line item. It sparked that viral song, 2035 Takes the High-Speed Rail to Taiwan. It makes the idea of connection very tangible, very modern, especially maybe for younger people thinking about travel and opportunity.
Making the abstract concrete.
Exactly. And it connects directly to another theme they push, focusing the discussion on post-unification governance.
Shifting the conversation from if to what happens after.
Precisely. Like the official statement that after unification, Taiwan's fiscal revenue would be used entirely to improve local livelihoods. That's designed to spark debate on the mainland about the benefits and practicalities of unification, not just the principle.
And why focus on governance specifically? What's the angle there?
It's about creating a contrast. The sources are quite critical of the current governance situation in Taiwan.
What kind of criticisms?
Things like persistent political infighting, infrastructure they describe as outdated, complaints about stagnant incomes for ordinary people, and they sometimes reference perceived issues in handling crises, like the pandemic response.
So they paint a picture of dysfunction.
Yes, of a system they argue is perhaps gridlocked or not delivering effectively for its people. And the implicit, sometimes explicit promise is
that post-unification governance, backed by the mainland's resources and focused on people-centered development, would be better.
That's the proposition. More stable, more efficient, delivering greater economic benefits and improved quality of life. It's an attempt to sell a vision of future prosperity and order as an alternative to perceived current struggles.
Okay, this brings us back full circle, almost, to that initial idea of China claiming dominance and initiative, taking control of the narrative and the timeline, making U.S. strategic ambiguity less relevant.
Yes, asserting what they call the China New Certainty. And this confidence is maybe most apparent when they discuss potential military scenarios.
How so?
Well, the analysis in these sources is remarkably clear. When they plan for military conflict, the primary adversary they consider is not Taiwan's own military forces.
Really? They dismiss them?
Largely, yes. The baseline threat they game out, the intervention they prepare for, is from the U.S. military.
That's putting Washington squarely in the crosshairs as the main obstacle.
Directly. They seem to operate on the assumption that overcoming local resistance is secondary to deterring or defeating U.S. intervention.
That sounds incredibly confident, maybe even overconfident. How do they justify that level of certainty about handling the U.S. military?
They often point to or reference reports about U.S. internal military simulations. For instance, they bring up that New York Times report from May that claimed the U.S. military had lost something like 18 consecutive war games, simulating a conflict with the PLA and the region.
Right, those war game reports circulate. Whether they're entirely accurate or reflect every scenario is debatable.
But the perception they create is what matters for this narrative. The analysts use it to argue that the cost for the U.S. to intervene successfully would be prohibitively high, maybe unsustainable. They believe geography and their own growing capabilities have shifted the balance fundamentally.
So the strategy isn't necessarily about invading Taiwan easily, but about making U.S. intervention unthinkable.
Deterrence of external forces seems paramount, and they apply a similar logic of, let's call it, structural certainty when dealing with other forms of external interference, like through international bodies.
Back to the UN again.
Exactly. They keep hammering the point that Taiwan joining the UN is, structurally, that pipe dream. They emphasize the Security Council veto, yes, but they also constantly reference UN Resolution 2758.
The resolution that recognized the PRC.
Yes. They use it as the legal bedrock, arguing the current international framework, recognized by the vast majority of countries, already settled the issue of China's representation, making attempts to give Taiwan separate status legally impossible within that system.
So a combination of military deterrence and legal assertion to block external interference.
That seems to be the approach.
One last point on this segment.
Yeah.
How do the sources portray the motivations of the pro-independence groups in Taiwan, the Green Camp as they call it?
It's quite a critical portrayal. They're generally depicted as being very short-sighted.
Short-sighted how?
Focused mainly on winning local elections, scoring political points, and, in this view, ignoring the larger long-term realities of Taiwan's geopolitical situation and economic dependence.
So they're accused of putting short-term politics ahead of long-term viability.
That's the accusation. that they willfully overlook the potential for economic isolation and the sheer imbalance of power, leading Taiwan down what the sources present as an unsustainable path, all for immediate political gain. Hashtag outro. So if we wrap all this up, what we've seen from this deep dive into the source material is a perspective where unification isn't just a goal, it's seen as inevitable, and the strategy is evolving.
Less about waiting, more about actively using comprehensive pressure, economic, legal, administrative soft power.
Yeah.
That China new certainty you mentioned.
Exactly. While always maintaining that military capability, but framing it primarily as a tool to deter external interference, especially from the U.S., which they cast as the source of instability, the U.S. new chaos.
So what does this all mean for you listening? Hopefully you now have a much clearer lens on the thinking, the specific tactics, and the underlying confidence driving this major geopolitical dynamic. It should help you make sense of the news and actions you see unfolding.
Understanding the perspective, even if you don't agree with it, is key.
Absolutely. And we'll leave you with a final provocative thought stemming from that discussion about governance. The sources suggest that any one country, two systems model for Taiwan would have to be very different from Hong Kong's, needing deep reforms focused on, quote, people-centered governance.
A bespoke model, essentially.
Right. So the question to ponder is this. Given Taiwan's distinct political identity and its advanced economy, what kind of unique political or social structure could theoretically blend the mainland's economic scale with Taiwan's developmental needs while addressing those governance critiques mentioned in the sources? Devising that model, and well, that's the massive design challenge for the future, isn't it?